Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In a small American town, the home of 68-year-old grandmother Helen Thompson was filled with laughter and memories. Since the tragic death of her 7-year-old grandson Ethan's parents, Helen had cared for him as if he were her own. She knew the boy's every habit, every smile, every fear. But the stability of their quiet life was about to be shattered by an unexpected legal battle. The local court had received a petition from Ethan's uncle, Robert Miller, who had returned to his nephew's life after years of absence. According to him, Helen was unfit to provide a suitable environment for the child. Helen, confident in her love and devotion, was ready to fight for Ethan. But what she didn't know was that the real shock would come from the boy himself. On the day of the hearing, Judge Smith, renowned for his neutrality, watched intently as Helen argued her case. The heavy silence in the courtroom was broken only by Ethan's muffled sobs and the lawyer's murmurings. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to protocol, until Ethan slowly stood up, his gaze frank, and spoke words no one could have anticipated. "I want to stay with my grandmother, but I have to tell you something." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge frowned, the lawyers exchanged worried glances, and Helen felt her heart sink. What the little boy revealed would not only upend the court's decision, but also bring to light deeply buried family truths that even adults had never dared to face. Helen Thompson, her silver hair neatly tied back, cared for little Ethan as she had for years. The house smelled of freshly baked bread and lavender, a comforting refuge for the child who had lost his parents. Every morning, she made him his favorite breakfast, pancakes with maple syrup and a glass of warm milk. Ethan laughed as he recounted his dreams of superheroes or dinosaurs, and Helen listened, fascinated by his vivid imagination. But that morning, a document slipped through her mailbox cast a cloud over their peaceful routine. A formal, icy court letter stated that her brother, Robert Miller, was seeking sole custody of Ethan. Robert, whom Helen hadn't seen in over a decade, had suddenly re-entered his nephew's life, claiming to want to make amends for what he felt was his grandmother's neglect. Helen felt her stomach clench. How could he pretend she wasn't capable? After all, she had raised Ethan with love, patience, and dedication. She remembered every night she had rocked him when he had nightmares, every morning she had wiped away his tears of sadness, and every afternoon at school, where she had encouraged him to read, to draw, to dream. The court scheduled the hearing in a week. Helen knew she had to prepare her defense, gather evidence and testimonies from neighbors and friends who could attest to the quality of her parenting. But what worried her most was Ethan. How would he react when he learned that his uncle, a man he hardly knew, was coming to claim custody of him? She tried to reassure the little boy. "Everything will be okay, darling," she whispered, stroking his curly hair. Ethan nodded, but she noticed the worry in his eyes. It wasn't just the fear of a courtroom that frightened the child, it was the fear of losing the one person who had always been there for him. That night, Helen barely slept. Memories of all those moments spent with Ethan flashed through her mind. She promised herself she would fight to the end to keep her grandson, without yet imagining the shocking revelation Ethan would make in court. On the day of the hearing, Helen entered the courtroom with Ethan at her side. The room was imposing. The walls were adorned with dark wood paneling, the wooden benches for the audience, and in the center, Judge Smith, seated on his dais, looked at each of the participants with cool but fair attention. The air was thick, charged with palpable tension, as if every breath counted. Robert Miller, Ethan's distant uncle, was already there, accompanied by his lawyer, a stern-looking man named Charles Reynolds. He smiled condescendingly, exuding a confidence that irritated Helen. She felt a dull anger rise within her, but forced herself to remain calm. Her role was to protect Ethan, and she knew that any excessive emotion could backfire. Judge Smith began the hearing with formalities, explaining everyone's rights and obligations. Then Robert spoke, his voice echoing through the room. "Your Honor, I am requesting full custody of my nephew, Ethan Miller, because I believe that his grandmother, although devoted, is unable to provide him with the framework necessary for his development." Helen felt her heart clench. Every word was an implicit attack on her entire life devoted to Ethan. She stood up with determination and answered in a firm but trembling voice. Your Honor, I am the only parental figure Ethan has ever known. Since his parents died, I have ensured his education, his health, his happiness. I am not just his grandmother, I am his family, his refuge, his entire world. Judge Smith nodded, carefully noting each argument. Then came the most delicate moment, Ethan's hearing. The shy but courageous little boy was invited to speak. Helen felt a lump of anxiety form in her throat. How could a 7-year-old understand and express what he felt in the midst of this tension? Ethan stood up, his small hands clenched on the bench. He took a deep breath, and in a voice surprisingly clear for his age, said, I want to stay with my grandmother. But I have to tell you something no one knows. An icy silence fell over the room. The judge frowned. Robert's lawyer let out a small, nervous chuckle. Helen felt her heart pound, but she gently squeezed Ethan's hand, silently encouraging him. What the little boy was about to reveal would change the course of the hearing, upset the entire family, and expose long-buried secrets. Ethan sat up in the small chair, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The silence in the room was almost deafening. Everyone held their breath, hanging on the child's every word. Helen, her heart pounding, felt her palms grow sweaty, but she said nothing, knowing this was Ethan's moment to speak. I want to stay with my grandmother, he began, his voice shaky but determined. But there's something you need to know. Judge Smith tilted his head slightly, curious, while Robert's lawyer frowned. Helen felt an icy fear rise in her chest. My dad. Ethan continued, my dad isn't really gone. He works for Robert. A murmur rippled through the room. The lawyers exchanged stunned glances. Robert opened his mouth, unable to respond immediately, while the judge frowned, clearly surprised by this turn of events. Helen felt her heart sink. She had always believed Robert to be an absent uncle, interested only in his own comfort. But if Ethan was telling the truth, then the man claiming custody of his nephew wasn't just a distant relative, he had been directly involved in the little boy's life, in secret. My dad told me not to say anything, Ethan continued, tears welling up in his eyes. But I want to stay with my grandmother. She's the only one who truly loves me. Judge Smith tapped his gavel lightly, calling for calm. Quiet in the room, he ordered. Then he turned to Robert. Mr. Miller, can you confirm or deny this statement from your nephew? Robert paled slightly, unable to meet the judge's gaze. That's not what, well, he stammered, visibly unsettled. Helen, her eyes filled with tears, took a deep breath and said forcefully. Your Honor, I never lied about my role in his life. I raised him, loved him, and protected him. No matter Robert's secrets. Ethan and I are family. The court remained silent for a few moments, everyone digesting this unexpected revelation. The judge wrote everything down in his file, clearly aware that this information would radically change the outlook of the case. Ethan, after saying those brave words, sat back down, clutching Helen's hand. She hugged him, feeling both fear and a strange sense of relief. The custody battle was only just beginning, but one thing was certain, the truth had just hit the room like a bolt from the blue, and no one could ignore the love between grandmother and grandson. After Ethan's revelation, the courtroom was electrified. The heavy silence that followed his words was thick with disbelief and tension. Robert Miller seemed unable to formulate a coherent response, while his attorney, Charles Reynolds, frantically tried to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, Reynolds began, his voice firm but betraying concern, this statement from the child is surprising, certainly, but it does not change my client's legal right to claim custody. Judge Smith nodded, frowning. Mr. Reynolds, I understand your arguments, but the child's words and emotional well-being must be taken into account. We cannot ignore the fact that he is expressing a deep and lasting bond with his grandmother. Helen felt a glimmer of hope. But she knew this was only the beginning of the fight. Robert slowly straightened, his face tense, and gave Helen an icy stare. "Your Honor," he said coldly, "I would like further investigations to be conducted. We need to know if this grandmother is truly capable of providing a safe and stable environment." The judge agreed, ordering an immediate social investigation. A social worker was assigned to visit Helen's home, interview Ethan, and assess their daily lives. Helen felt her heart sink. She knew of his love and devotion, but she knew that every detail of his life would be scrutinized with suspicion. Meanwhile, Ethan silently watched the confrontation. His eyes shone with worry, but he held his grandmother's hand with determination. "Don't worry, darling," Helen whispered. "We'll show that we're a real family." The hearing resumed with detailed questions about Ethan's life, his diet, his school, his activities, and most importantly, his relationship with Helen. The judge wanted to understand the boy's daily life, his habits, and especially his attachment to his grandmother. At the end of the day, the social worker, Mrs. Carter, took Helen aside. "Your home is warm and your connection to Ethan is obvious," she said softly. "But everything will need to be documented and you will need to be prepared to answer all questions. Robert will not give up." Helen nodded, determined. She knew the battle would be long, but she was ready to do anything to protect Ethan. And she still didn't know that her grandson's next revelations would shake up not only the court, but the entire Miller family. A few days later, Mrs. Carter, the social worker, arrived at Helen's home to assess Ethan's living environment. Helen had meticulously prepared everything. The house was clean and tidy, Ethan's toys neatly arranged, and photos of their happy times adorned the walls. Ethan, despite his anxiety, seemed determined to cooperate. But as soon as Mrs. Carter began asking questions, he looked down and whispered something to his grandmother. "Grandma, I have to tell you something before she asks." Helen felt a lump form in her throat. "What, darling?" she asked softly. I've never told anyone, but sometimes Robert comes to see me secretly. He doesn't want you to know." Helen felt her heart stop for a moment. This explained some of the strange visits and disturbing phone calls she hadn't been paying enough attention to. She took a deep breath and whispered to Ethan, "Thanks for telling me. We'll talk about it calmly, okay?" During the interview, Mrs. Carter observed Ethan closely. The child talked about his routines, his games, his meals, and especially his attachment to his grandmother. Then, timidly, he mentioned Robert's secret visits. "He comes sometimes when my grandmother is not there, he says it's for me, but it scares me." Mrs. Carter's expression changed immediately. She took notes, frowned, and looked at Helen seriously. "This is very important information. It may affect the court's judgment on the child's safety and well-being." Helen nodded, her heart filled with both fear and determination. "I knew something was up," she whispered. "But we're going to get to the bottom of it. I'll never leave Ethan alone with him." That evening, Helen and Ethan sat together at the kitchen table. The dim lights created a warm atmosphere despite the commotion outside. Helen took Ethan's hand and said, "Thank you for trusting me, my darling. We will show the court that we are a real family and that no one can separate us." Ethan nodded, feeling for the first time that he could be heard and protected. But he still didn't know that his courage would soon reveal another, even more surprising secret, capable of completely changing the battle for his custody. A few days after the social visit, the hearing resumed. The atmosphere in the room was tense, everyone aware that the upcoming decisions could change Ethan's life forever. Helen sat by her grandson's side, holding his hand firmly to give him courage. When Judge Smith called Ethan to speak, the little boy stood with unusual determination. He took a deep breath and looked around the courtroom, his eyes shining with a maturity strange for his age. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice trembling slightly, "I've never told the whole truth before." A complete silence fell. The judge leaned in slightly, listening to every word. Helen felt her heart pound. "My dad. Robert," Ethan said, glancing quickly at his uncle, "he gave me something I should never have had. A key. A key to get into his house, whenever I wanted." Murmurs rippled through the room. Robert's lawyer, Charles Reynolds, stood up immediately, trying to cut off the statement. "Your Honor, I strongly dispute." But the judge raised his hand to maintain silence. Ethan continued. "I found some papers that said my mom and dad had planned to give me to my grandmother if something happened to her." Helen felt her tears well up. She knew of Ethan's parents' love, but this official confirmation, coming from her own son, shocked the entire courtroom. It was proof that his role was not just emotional, but legally and morally based on his parents' wishes. The judge took a serious note, glancing at Robert, who seemed increasingly unsettled. "It appears," the judge said calmly, "that the parents' wishes, as well as the child's emotional attachment to his grandmother, play a significant role in this decision." Helen hugged Ethan as soon as he returned to his seat, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and emotion. But even though this revelation seemed to tip the scales in their favor, Helen knew Robert wouldn't give up easily and that more legal maneuvering was on the cards. That evening, Helen and Ethan returned home, exhausted but determined. Helen whispered to her grandson. "You were brave today, Ethan. We will keep fighting, and nothing and no one will be able to separate us." Ethan nodded, feeling like he'd finally been heard. But in the shadows, Robert was already planning his next move, determined to challenge this revelation and attempt to take what he believed was his. A few days after the last hearing, Helen received an urgent summons. Robert Miller had filed a new request. He was requesting a full psychological evaluation of Ethan and even Helen, claiming that the boy might be influenced by his grandmother. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Robert would stop at nothing. At the hearing, Robert entered with cool confidence, his lawyer at his side. Helen remained calm but determined, her gaze fixed on her grandson, who seemed to understand the significance of this moment. "Your Honor," began Charles Reynolds, Robert's attorney, "we have discovered evidence that suggests the child may be being emotionally manipulated by his grandmother. We request a full evaluation to protect the child's best interests." Judge Smith frowned. "Very well. A psychological evaluation will be conducted," he replied. "But I remind you that the child's emotional attachment to his grandmother will be taken into account." Helen felt a surge of frustration, but she forced herself to remain calm. She knew Ethan needed to remain strong and confident. Once the hearing was over, they left the room, the tension weighing heavily on their shoulders. The next day, a child psychologist, Dr. Laura Benson, arrived at Helen's home for the evaluation. Ethan, a little intimidated but courageous, answered the questions truthfully. He talked about his routine, his attachment to Helen, and the love he felt for his grandmother. Then came the awkward moment. Helen was asked about her approach to raising Ethan, her patience, her rules, and her values. She answered honestly, explaining every detail of her daily life and the education she provided. At the end of the visit, Dr. Benson stood up, a slight smile on his face. "Your bond with Ethan is extremely strong and positive. The child is happy, stable, and thriving. Any attempt to separate him from his grandmother could have a significant emotional impact." This statement gave Helen courage. But she knew Robert wouldn't give up. He was already planning his next move, something more subtle and even more destabilizing, designed to sow doubt in the minds of the court. That evening, Helen leaned over Ethan and whispered, "We've reached an important milestone today, my dear. But we must remain united and strong. Robert doesn't know who he's dealing with." Ethan nodded, squeezing his grandmother's hand. He understood the battle was far from over, but he felt their love for each other could overcome any obstacle. A few weeks later, the case took an unexpected turn. Robert Miller, sensing that Ethan's revelations and the psychological report were working against him, decided to strike a blow. He sent a letter to the court, claiming that Helen had committed gross negligence in the past, without providing any concrete evidence. Judge Smith, surprised by this sudden attack, called an emergency hearing to consider these charges. Helen, though shocked, remained calm. She knew the truth would eventually come out. Ethan, sitting at her side, squeezed her hand tightly, giving her silent courage. At the hearing, Robert's lawyer presented the letter and attempted to sow doubt. "Your Honor," he said, these accusations must be taken very seriously. We request that the child be temporarily placed under neutral supervision until these matters are clarified. Helen took a deep breath. This was a trap, a ploy to intimidate her away from her grandson. But instead of responding with anger, she let Ethan speak. The judge, curious, invited the boy to speak. Ethan, with surprising maturity, stood up and said, "Your Honor, I know my uncle is trying to say things about my grandmother, but it's all false. She takes care of me every day. She protects me, she loves me, and I never want to be separated from her." Silence fell over the room. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Robert paled, unable to respond to the innocence and power of the child's words. Judge Smith carefully noted, the child's word, his attachment to his grandmother, as well as psychological reports, must be taken into account. Any unsupported accusation will not be sufficient to modify the current custody. Helen felt an immense sense of relief, but she knew the battle wasn't over yet. She hugged Ethan and whispered, "You were amazing today, my darling. Thanks to you, we withstood that attack." Ethan smiled shyly, but a sense of pride shone in his eyes. He had just played a key role in protecting the person he loved most in the world. However, Helen had a feeling that Robert would still plan something more treacherous and unpredictable, to try to regain what he could never truly obtain, Ethan's love and trust. The final hearing was approaching. Helen knew this session would decide Ethan's fate and their future. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The benches were filled with neighbors, friends, and family members, all there to support Helen and demonstrate the love and stability she offered Ethan. Robert Miller entered, confident, wearing his usual cold smile. But Helen noticed a slight tremor in his hand. He knew that Ethan's revelations and the psychological reports were now working against him. Judge Smith opened the hearing, announcing that all evidence, testimony, and reports would be considered before rendering his decision. Robert's lawyers attempted to challenge some of the evidence, but the judge remained strict. All accusations must be based on verifiable facts. Emotions, family ties, and the child's well-being take precedence. Then came the decisive moment. Ethan, sitting on the bench next to Helen, was invited to speak. The boy, his gaze determined, stood up and addressed the court directly. "Your Honor, I want to stay with my grandmother. She is the only person who has always protected and loved me. I know my uncle is trying to separate me from her, but I don't want to. I love her." An absolute silence fell over the room. The judges and lawyers were struck by the child's maturity and sincerity. Even Robert looked away, unable to sustain that pure and genuine gaze. Helen felt her tears fall, but she remained proud and strong, holding Ethan in her arms after his testimony. The neighbors and friends present applauded silently, touched by the little boy's courage. Judge Smith, after taking note of all the testimony and psychological reports, delivered his decision. After reviewing all the evidence, listening to the testimony, and considering the child's words, it is clear that Ethan's well-being rests on his relationship with his grandmother. Helen Thompson is therefore awarded sole custody of Ethan. Any further challenge will be dismissed. A breath of relief rippled through the room. Helen hugged Ethan, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Robert, humiliated and helpless, left the courtroom without a word, realizing he could never destroy this unique and sincere bond. That day, Helen and Ethan left the courtroom hand in hand, more united than ever. They knew that despite the obstacles, their love and devotion to each other had triumphed. A few weeks after the court's decision, Helen and Ethan began to return to normal life. The house that had been the scene of so much anguish and legal battles became a warm haven, filled with laughter and happy memories. Ethan, despite being 7 years old, seemed more mature and confident. He told his friends at school about his love for his grandmother and the adventures they shared together. Helen, on the other hand, savored every moment, aware of how fragile and precious these moments were. One evening, sitting on the couch after dinner, Ethan looked at Helen and said with a small smile, "Grandma, I knew you would always protect me. Thank you for never giving up." Helen felt her eyes fill with tears. She took the little boy in her arms and whispered, "My darling, you are my world. Nothing and no one will ever be able to separate us." A few days later, Helen received a letter from the court officially confirming that she had been awarded permanent custody of Ethan. Robert's threats and legal maneuvering were now over. But more importantly, Helen and Ethan had learned something valuable: mutual love and trust are stronger than any difficulties or obstacles. Their bond, forged in adversity, had become unbreakable. That evening, as the sun set and bathed the house in a golden light, Helen and Ethan sat together on the porch. Helen watched her grandson play with his toys, smiling, and thought about everything they had been through. "We won," she whispered. "And we will continue to move forward together." Ethan looked up at her, confident and happy. "Yes, Granny, together forever." And in that simple yet moving moment, Helen knew that no matter what storms came, their love and family bond would always be stronger than anything. The battle was over, but life was just beginning.